Hi everybody, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and as many of you probably know, sadly the 7th World Chess Champion, Vasily Smyslov, died this past week on Saturday morning on March 27. He was 89 years old, and that makes him, I guess, the oldest world champion by a few years over Botvinnik, which is pretty impressive. And well, a little bit about his career. I'm sure most of you have some idea by now, if you didn't already. He was world champion for just a year from 1957 to 1958 when he beat Botvinnik, and then Botvinnik beat him in the rematch the year after that. Earlier, 3 years before that, before 57, he had drawn Botvinnik in a match for the title, and his championship career was a very long one. He first got to play for the title in 1948 in the famous match tournament, which settled the title in lieu of Vilyakin's death in 46. So Botvinnik won that by a pretty comfortable margin, but Smyslov came in second there. In 1950, I think he took fourth, maybe even fifth, in the candidates then, but he won the candidates in 53, won it again in 56. He didn't make the candidates again until 65 and lost to Geller. And then after that, he didn't make the candidates until 1984, which was really remarkable because at that time he was 63 years old. He made it in 82, and then he won his first two matches in the candidates cycle. And then finally, it was only Kasparov, playing in his first and only candidates event, who stopped him. So pretty remarkable. From 1948, his first crack at the title, through 1984, 36 years later, he's still right there, and pretty extraordinary. And in fact, he was still playing up through his 70s, and I think his last event was in 2001. And really, the only reason he stopped playing at that point is because his eyesight was just terrible. He had been virtually blind for a number of years, even by that point. Smyslov continued, though, to play or to spent a lot of time with chess. He was was really an outstanding study composer, and as far as I know, continued to compose studies, perhaps even up to near his death. When he was playing as an old man, he was continuing to play very strongly. In 1991, at the age of 70, he won the World Senior Championship, and was still competing quite reasonably through the 90s. So really an exceptional player. Exceptional, of course, in his skill and in his longevity as well. In terms of how he played, the word that's always attributed to him is harmony, that his pieces always seem to have this beautiful coordination. So it wasn't this very energetic kind of style that Tal had, striving for complications. You have this real sense of just the kind of a clear simplicity to his style, where you look at his games, and in many of them you feel like you could have done that yourself. Anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at this game. Now, one of the things I wanted to say about Smyslov also, while he's very famous for his endgame contributions as a player, as a study composer, and as a theoretician, there's a very famous book on rook endings that he co-authored with Gregory Levenfish. He was also a great openings innovator, too, and we'll see one of his very important novelties in this game. So this was played against Svetozar Gligorich, another relatively old fellow from the former Yugoslavia. And this was played in 1959 in a match between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. So Gligorich had white, Smyslov had black. And Gligorich, as I said, is still alive. I think he's... What is he now? I think he's about 75. No, sorry, 85. Yeah, he was born in 1925, I believe. So he's certainly getting up there as well. Well, maybe not just getting up there. He is up there. Anyway, G6, Knight C3, D5. Oh, I should say, a lot of these older generation folks are passing, obviously. But one very, very old guy still remains alive. Gligorich is getting there, certainly. But don't forget Andrew Lilienthal. So he's Hungarian grandmaster, lived in the Soviet Union for some time, and best known as a chess player for his famous victory over Capablanca in the 1934-1935 Hastings event, where he sacrificed his queen. Interestingly, that game is kind of a forerunner to a very famous and beautiful game between Tal and Hans Joachim Hecht that you definitely want to look up if you don't know it already. Anyway, Lilienthal will be 100 years old next year, so that's even more impressive than Smyslov. Okay, so back to the game. So we have the Grunfeld, which already in the 50s was quite well known and deeply explored, at least by the standards of the day. And here, back then, and it's still very, very common and important today, C takes d4, cd4, bishop g4, f3, knight a5, bishop to d3, bishop e6 was already very heavily analyzed at the time, including the exchange sack with d5. So Smyslov came up with a brand new approach, and it's one that at the moment is even more popular than the c takes d4 line, and that's queen to c7. So a very elegant solution to Black's development problem. So he's going to play the rook to d8, and you can see again this harmony idea. All of Black's pieces work very nicely together. So no one steps in anyone else's way. They all perform independent functions. And as for the queen side, he'll play b6 and bishop to b7, or maybe b6, knight a5, and the bishop might go to a6 in some cases too. Okay, so here rook c1 is the main move, and that's what Gligorich played in this, the first outing of this queen c7 line. Rook to b1 has been played. It doesn't really seem to be very worrisome for Black at all. So rook c1, rook to d8, and now here there are a bunch of moves that have been played. Gligorich played h3, which is very logical because he wants to play f4. Surprisingly, though, after f4, there's a very famous and beautiful game, Geller against Smyslov from the 65 candidates, where Smyslov played e6, after king h1, b6, f5, just got hammered. A very famous game where Geller sacrifices his queen like 4 or 5 times in a row. Beautiful game. You definitely want to check that one out as well. However, as I mentioned, after f4, simply bishop to g4 is the right move, and Black is doing fine. Clearly, he has lots of pressure against White's center. And this is, of course, very typical of these Grunfeld lines where White plays the exchange variation and then puts the bishop on c4. Especially, Black is really just hammering away at this d4 pawn. Okay, so that's the idea behind h3. Other moves have been played too. So queen to e1 has been played, just getting out of the way and maybe hoping to play f3 and queen h4 or queen f2. Fischer once played e6 against this and lost a famous game to Spassky. White played f4 and attacked away, but maybe the best move and the most common move now is to play queen a5 with the nice idea of more or less trying to enforce a queen trade with takes and takes. And once the queens are off the board, then one of Black's big worries, White's ability to turn this central control into a kingside attack, will be done away with. Okay, another idea is queen to d2, and again, queen a5 is a pretty good solution to this. Same idea of trying to swap the queens. b6 can be played too, but queen a5 I think is most common and I would say the most natural approach. The most important move nowadays is bishop to f4, and I've tried this as well, at least in blitz games. And okay, e5 sometimes gets played, but bishop to e5 is the main move. And now White drops the bishop back, and after bishop takes g3, both pawn recaptures are very important and theoretically significant. So f takes g3 was played in, I think it's Caruana against Morozevich from late last year, and I think White won that game, but as far as the theoretical significance goes, Black I think was all right there. Black has tried 3 moves here. Knight to e5 is the old move, and it's not getting played anymore. I'm not sure if it's because there's something wrong with knight to e5 or because the other moves seem to be more promising. Rook to f8 is possible, and I think e6 has been played a couple of times lately, including by Julio Becerra. Alright, so that's fg3. And then hg3 was played by Shirov against Svidler. It didn't give him anything. Svidler played e5, bishop e6, And Smyslov even went on to win, though this position is probably about equal. But black's position seems a bit more comfortable to me. Okay, so with all of this behind us, then let's look at the actual game move. So h3. So again, very natural. He wants to play f4 and isn't allowing bishop to g4 to thwart his plans. Okay, a6 has been played here, and it was played by Carlsen, in fact, in Nanjing last year. But the main move, I think, is b6. Certainly, both moves are worthwhile. Okay, so after b6, again, white can try various moves here. It might play bishop to f4. Again, black would play bishop to e5. He could play bishop to d3. Okay, that's been played too by Vityugov, who's a very strong young grandmaster. But okay, f4 is the thematic move. Oh, one other move. Yeah, this is a computer suggestion here, so it hasn't been played. It certainly doesn't look like a normal Grunfeld move, but it's actually not such a bad idea. Getting out of the pin, and okay, ideas like rook f to d1 and queen to a3 might actually have some merit here. So I don't know if this is a great idea or not, but it might be something interesting to check out. Okay, in any case, f4 is the move that Gligorich played. And this looks kind of scary. I mean, white's got this enormous pawn center, and he's not even behind in development either. So it might seem like this should be not very good for black, but in fact he's fine. Okay, so it starts off with e6, trying to blunt the bishop on c4's its aggression here. Okay, white plays queen e1, getting out of the pin. And okay, here Smyslov played bishop to b7. Maybe knight to a5 is more accurate. And only after bishop to d3, then to play f5. Okay, and this actually is how a famous game between Spassky and Fischer went. So Fischer, I joke with people, Fischer played the Grunfeld defense on two occasions. One is when he wanted to defeat a Byrne brother in a brilliant way, and the other occasion is when he wanted to lose an important game. So he lost twice to Spassky and once to Petrosian in important Grunfeld games. But nevertheless, as far as the theoretical significance of this particular game with Spassky from Siegen in 1970 in the Olympiad goes, black was okay. So it went g4, f takes e4, bishop e4, bishop b7, knight g3, knight c4, and black was okay. In fact, he's even a little bit better. After takes, bishop f2, queen c6, queen e2. Maybe queen e4 is better, but it's kind of an admission that white didn't get anything from the opening here, to be sure. So queen e2, takes, and b5. And okay, Fischer eventually lost, but not because of this position. So he's even a little bit better here. Okay. So, as I said, knight a5 might be the most accurate move, but played bishop to b7. And here, Gligorich probably went a little bit astray here with queen to f2. Better move was f5, as Smyslov himself points out in his notes. So now black doesn't get that nice blockade. And after knight a5, white has two possibilities here, both of which are mentioned by Smyslov. So if bishop to d3, then e takes f5, e takes f5, and rook e8. And here black is doing very well. All of his pieces are pretty well coordinated. And if white plays queen f2, which is very natural, he loses. So here's a little tactical puzzle for you. Doesn't really require that much time to solve this, maybe 15 seconds. Well, the answer, and you can do this in either order actually, is c4, bishop retreats, and queen e7. And two guys are hanging here, so black wins a piece and should win the game. Okay, but here the position is relatively equal. But better than bishop to d3 is f takes e6. This is the best move here. And it's actually pretty unclear. So knight c4, rook f7, queen c8, and Smyslov stops here. We can mention a couple of possibilities. So one is to play queen h4, and now if knight takes e3, black is up two pieces for two pawns, and he's about to go up even more material, but it's an immediate perpetual check. So if the king goes to h6, queen h4, and if the king goes to g8 or h8, then queen f7, queen f6. is perpetual. So if black wants to try to win, he should play queen takes e6, but this is still a draw. Rook to e7, queen d6, bishop f4, so we can just keep kicking him, and d5. And if the queen leaves, then at the very least, white will have rook takes g7, and the same perpetual, but might even have more. So rook takes d5 is probably the best move. Ed, queen d5, queen g5 defends the mate, and white's up the exchange for a pawn, but black's bishops are beautiful, and the knight on c4 is very good as well. So it's about equal. Okay, another move instead of queen h4 is bishop to g5, and black can return the material here, and again this will end up approximately equal. So after all of the captures here, and let's say rook to f1, material is even. Black's king is a little bit exposed, obviously, but in terms of everything else, black is a little bit better. So all balanced, it's about equal here. Anyway, f5 would have been the best try. After queen f2, now Smyslov gets his blockading plan perfectly. So now white's minor pieces, you can see, are very restricted, and black's pieces function just beautifully. I mean, everyone is pretty much where he ought to be. Okay, white plays e5, and now black to move. What should you do here? So this is, I think, an impressive moment. Well, the sort of textbook approach here would involve trying to exploit the queen side and maybe try to put a piece on c4. So that's what makes Smyslov's move a little bit paradoxical. He plays c4. And so now all of a sudden the knight on a5 just doesn't really make much sense. I mean, what's it going to do? Well, there is of course another place for it to go, but it looked like c4 is a really nice square. And even when you put the knight on d5, well, then the bishop on b7 might be slightly offended. However, this is absolutely the right way to play. So even though it does take away one possible trump later on for black, it further restricts the white pieces. I mean, these guys here are just doing nothing. I mean, they're all just locked up here. White's rooks are locked up. Meanwhile, black has this fantastic diagonal, and he has this very useful 3-on-2 queenside majority, which he can slowly but surely advance. So, he'll bring the knight to d7, or sorry, e7, and maybe bring it to d5 at some apt moment. Play b5, a5, and get these doggies rolling with a very, very nice position. Okay, Gligerich played bishop to c2. A couple of people later played bishop to b1. It really doesn't make much difference. So knight to c6. Nothing for the knight to do on a5 anymore. And now white plays g4. So he doesn't want to just sit there and wait for black to kill him on the queen side, so he's going for play. On the other hand, it's extending the diagonal. Now black can have access to h1 in some variations, so it's a pretty double-edged move. Okay, continues the plan. White does the same and takes care of queen h1 check ideas. Here, Smyslov played queen to c6, and it's certainly not bad. But another very interesting and non-traditional idea is rook to d5, with the idea of swinging the rook over to a5. And I kind of like this idea, even though it's again not part of the usual recipe, but it makes a lot of sense. Black, again, I already mentioned, has the possible plan of advancing the queenside pawns, and this way the rook gets active in advance, and also, let's say, doesn't get stuck with the traffic jam on d5. So it's an interesting idea. Anyway, queen c6 is certainly not a bad move. Okay, knight to g3, b5, and white plays a4. So not waiting around here for black to play a5 and then be able to respond with b4. So this is a good move. Okay, a6, rook to b1. So black has still some obstacles to overcome here before he can really just fully have his way with what's going on the queen side. So rook a to b8 makes good sense. Bishop to d2. And here Smyslov probably makes a little bit of an error. He should probably play bishop to a8, as Kasparov and others have noted, followed by something like knight to d5, bishop to f8, and just preparing everything on the queen side first, and only then maybe playing for b takes a4. So that would have increased his chances. So he took, and we'll see that this ugly-looking move actually has a very, very good idea behind it. But again, it wasn't the most accurate move. Okay, so Gligorich plays rook to a1 and bishop a4. So he regains the pawn. And okay, after queen c7, black is also hopped off of the long diagonal for the moment. So this is a little bit of progress for white. Okay, rook a2, rook b6. This is a good move, preparing to double in some cases, and also protecting the pawn on e6. All right, g takes f5. Excuse me. And now, which way should black recapture? So another little quiz for you. Well, the wrong way is with the g pawn, because after rook to g1 or knight to h5, black is already going to be in trouble. So that's definitely not the way to go. So you just play e takes f5. And we don't want to play knight takes f5 because this knight could still go to d5, and it's a much better piece than white's knight on g3. So there's absolutely no reason to play that way. So e takes f5 is the right move. Okay, bishop to c1, preparing to swing it to a3 in some cases. Knight to d5, knight e2, protecting the c pawn, a5, and now white probably should have played bishop to a3. So this would have made good sense, puts the bishop on a good diagonal, but he played bishop to c2. And this certainly is a very natural move. So he's hitting the a5 pawn, and he's maybe threatening, okay, not bishop f5 right away, but maybe, knight to g3, rook g1, and then taking on f5 could be quite dangerous for black. But it's perhaps underestimates what black does still have going on the queen side. So Smyslov found a very, very nice move here, rook to b3. Now, as some have noted, bishop to d2 was probably a better move here, but Gligorich wanted it to be shown. So he played bishop takes b3, cb, and now he could play rook to a1. This might be objectively best, but it's passive, of course. So he played rook to a4. And anyway, let's take stock about this position before we really go on. So white's up a full exchange here, and he has a protected passed pawn on e5. And black's bishop, his dark-colored bishop, doesn't look very good. The other bishop, of course, looks terrific, but it seems like all the good squares are covered. And as long as the queenside pawns are blockaded, it really seems a little bit murky what it is that black has. But in fact, black is better, and it's just a question of how much better he is. Okay, well here I think he should play bishop to c6, and this would have been best. And if the rook retreats, then a4 or rook to b8 is quite good. If he tries rook to c4, which I guess was the idea of rook to a4, then bishop to f8, and now this rook on c4 is trapped, so black is going to follow up with queen to b7 and bishop to b5. Or, of course, he could just play knight to b6 right here, if it's his move. He should not play knight takes c3, though. This is a mistake, as this position is kind of unclear. So, again, white's up a full exchange, but obviously black's pieces are great, but until he can actually break through somewhere, it's unclear. Okay, so, well, I shouldn't say it's a mistake, knight takes c3, but it's definitely not best. Okay, so bishop to f8, though, is also inaccurate, though also quite sensible. Now here, white should have played c4, just mixing things up. And then black can try either knight to b4, as Smyslov notes, with ideas like b2 and knight to d3, or of course queen to c6. So a lot of ideas here, but, and of course he's threatening the c pawn as well. Or another idea is to play knight to b6, rook a5, knight c4, and then if rook to b5, rook to b8, takes and takes. And again, black has terrific compensation for the exchange, but whether he's objectively better or not remains unclear. So after bishop to f8, Gligorich played bishop to b2, which is very natural. So he protects the c3 pawn, blockades the b2 pawn, and maybe if he plays c4, he can hope for d5 and e6, and maybe to stir up some trouble on the long diagonal. But black to move here, what should you do? Because it looks like white just has the exits pretty well sealed up here, or the entrances. But Smyslov finds a way in. He plays knight to e3. Okay, so he wants to jump the knight into c4. Of course, he'll take the rook on f1 if permitted. And the tactical point, of course, is that if queen takes e3, queen c6, and we have a fork, queen g2 mate, and queen takes a4. Okay, so Gligorich played rook f to a1. Smyslov plays knight to c4, attacking the bishop. Here, white could try to sack the exchange, but after bishop to e7, maybe white is okay, barely, but he's under tremendous pressure. One idea for black is to play bishop to h4. So Smyslov gives this line, and it looks pretty good. So knight to g3 is what Gligorich tried. Okay, again, of course, defending the bishop on b2. All right, now bishop to e7. So the idea, again, is to play bishop h4 and really tie white down all over the place. So again, white is up the exchange and has two connected passed pawns in the center of the board, no less. But they're absolutely blockaded. And his minor pieces are terrible. The rooks on the a-file are neutralized, so this is a good position for black. If white tries to break the glass here with knight f5, it doesn't work. Takes, check, here, queen g3, and then simply bishop to d5, and white's attack is nothing. Black is just winning there with the extra material. But maybe the best move here is queen to e2, hitting the knight again. So bishop to d5, and now knight to f1. So the point is, black of course wants to have the queen in front of the bishop, so that way it's a mate threat. So the idea of queen to e2 is to force the opposite. So bishop d5, now knight f1, rook a8, preparing perhaps to play knight to b6 at some point, though not yet, or maybe to play queen c6, queen b5, and then knight to b6. Well, you can't even do that because the queen hangs. So rook to a8 is maybe more or less forced, but it's still not easy to push white back. So knight e3, takes, bishop to c6. This is given by Smyslov, but the rest of his analysis is maybe a little bit inaccurate. So the best move here for white is c4. Takes, queen to b6, and this position is definitely very unclear. Maybe white is a touch better, but it is a messy position. So I think, Smyslov had been just a little bit inaccurate earlier, and so this was maybe a chance for white to come out okay. In the game, he played knight to f1 right away, and of course Smyslov got the pieces the right way around with queen to c6. So now knight to e3 is of course impossible because knight takes e3 and then queen takes e3, queen g2 mate. Best is probably knight to g3, but again, bishop to h4, and maybe white needs to sack the exchange here. Otherwise, he's just he's lost. I mean, the threat's knight takes b2, and actually, I don't know if that's quite winning, but it's super duper dangerous. Let me think. So maybe, if it's black's move, maybe something like bishop takes g3. All right, the king has to take, then knight takes b2, queen takes b2, queen f3 check, queen f4 check, queen g3 check, and then bishop to e4. And that looks pretty well crushing. So white needs to give up the exchange. If he does it this way, I think it's not so good. Takes, g5, and black is going to crash through on the king side. So the better way is rook c4, and then queen to f1. And white has decent chances to survive here. It's not a fun position, but he does at least have 3 passed pawns to keep him company. Okay. Instead, though, he tried rook takes c4. And the idea is that on queen takes c4, knight to e3, say queen c7, and c4, and white's queenside or central passers just start to move down the board like Space Invaders. So this position is actually not so bad for white. I mean, his pawns are pretty dangerous. But rook takes c4 is a mistake. So see if you can figure out why it's a mistake. The answer is queen to h1 check, which is what happened. King to g3, and now h5. And Gligorich resigned. And the problem is the threat is just to play h4 mate. And there's not really any convenient way to get out of this. h4 from white, bishop takes h4 as mate, that's no help. And if queen to e2, then queen to g1 check forces mate next move, queen g2, and then h4 or queen takes g2 mate. So we'll do it the elegant way, queen g2, h4. Okay, so after h5, Gligorich resigned. And very, very nice game by Smyslov. I mean, he invented this whole plan. I mean, this was, nowadays such ideas don't look, or such games don't look all that unusual, or at least wouldn't look all that unusual between two players of unequal caliber. But Gligorich is one of the best players in the world. I mean, he's a many-time candidate himself, and I mean, he was just, pretty convincingly outplayed. So again, there were some inaccuracies, but the point is Gligorich never really knew how to, never succeeded in taking advantage of them. And the strategic plan that Gligorich had in mind worked very, very successfully. So a very nice game, really kind of a model game despite the inaccuracies. I mean, it's a model game because we saw a really thematic idea by Black, and Black was able to put this thematic idea into practice. So the long-term advantages that he gained from this system were ultimately what won him the game. So this queen c7 idea was invented here by Smyslov. Rook c1, rook to d8, okay, h3, and again, it's just a very beautiful setup that he creates. Okay, f4, e6, okay, again, knight a5 is a little bit more accurate, but okay, bishop to b7, queen f2, knight a5, so this beautiful blockading plan. So the knight goes to a5, puts the pawn on f5, puts the pawn on c4, and then swings the knight around to control the d5 square. So, outstanding performance by Smyslov, a terrific idea, and very instructive for Grunfeld players, and for that matter, for those of us who are more likely to face the Grunfeld, so we can see what kinds of things it is that we need to avoid. So this long-term, long diagonal problem for white ultimately cost him the game, and really in general, this control over the light squares. So the exchange sack that he devised is, again, beautifully thematic. So it lets him just take over the light squares all over the place, and that's just what he did. Right, so we see here, for instance, I mean, the knight's on c4, it's perfect. The queen and the bishop are on the long diagonal, they're perfect. And as a result, white has problems on the long diagonal with his king. His passed pawns, he's got 3 connected passed pawns, and they are absolutely powerless. In fact, if anything, they give him this kind of absurd structure. Okay, so pawn, 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 not even as good as a pawn, and the rook is not much better either. So you've got these 5 pieces in a row, and the further along you go on this diagonal, the least, or the less well-functioning each unit is. So the pawn on e5 is pretty good. The pawn on d4 is okay. It's not as good. The pawn on c3 is even worse. The bishop on b2 is disastrous. And the rook on a1 is, it only exists for an inevitable exchange sacrifice, which never happened. So, very nice game. Again, Smyslov made it look pretty easy. I mean, all these natural moves, a couple little tactics here and there, and there were a couple of inaccuracies, but basically it looked just like he found one really nice idea and was able to write it all the way in. And this is characteristic of a lot of his games, a lot of his great games. It doesn't look like he has anything special, and the guy just collapses in model form, like in a model game kind of style. Okay, well, I'll quit bloviating about this game now. I hope you enjoyed it, and for those of you who aren't familiar with Smyslov, I hope this encourages you to take a closer look at some of his great games. So thanks a lot, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.